The morning sun painted the cobblestone streets of London in golden hues as thousands of people lined the parade route. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, mothers clutched their purses tight, and elderly folks claimed the best spots hours before the royal procession was scheduled to begin. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Among the crowd stood 8-year-old Emma Thompson, barely visible between the towering adults around her. Her small frame was dwarfed by the sea of people, and despite standing on her tiptoes, she could only catch glimpses of the street beyond the forest of legs and bodies. Emma wore her best dress, a pale blue frock that her grandmother had sewn for her birthday, and her dark hair was neatly braided with ribbons that matched her outfit. Emma had been looking forward to this day for months. The Royal Guard parade happened only once a year, and this was the first time her parents had allowed her to come into the city to watch. Her mother, Sarah, held her hand firmly while keeping one eye on the crowd and another on her daughter. The crush of people made Sarah nervous, but seeing Emma's bright smile and sparkling eyes made the discomfort worthwhile. "Can you see anything, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, bending down to speak directly into Emma's ear over the noise of the crowd. Emma shook her head, her lower lip trembling slightly with disappointment. She had imagined herself having a perfect view of the magnificent horses, the colorful uniforms, and the gleaming instruments of the royal band. Instead, all she could see were the backs of coats, handbags, and occasionally someone's elbow. The crowd grew thicker as the parade's start time approached. People pushed forward, trying to secure better positions, and Emma found herself being squeezed between bodies. She felt overwhelmed and a little frightened by the mass of humanity surrounding her. The excited chatter of the adults above her head created a constant hum that made it difficult to hear her mother's reassuring voice. Suddenly, a commotion arose from somewhere behind them. A man was shouting about a lost wallet, accusing others in the crowd of being pickpockets. The atmosphere shifted from festive to tense as people began looking around suspiciously at their neighbors. Emma felt her mother's grip on her hand tighten. "Stay close to me," Sarah whispered urgently. "Don't let go of my hand for even a second." As the argument escalated, more people turned to look at the disturbance. In the chaos that followed, someone bumped into Sarah hard, causing her to stumble forward. For a brief moment, her grip on Emma's hand loosened. That was all it took. Emma felt herself being swept along by the movement of the crowd, like a small leaf caught in a rushing river. One moment she was holding her mother's familiar hand, and the next she was surrounded by strangers' legs and bodies, all moving in different directions. She called out for her mother, but her small voice was completely drowned out by the noise around her. Panic rose in Emma's chest as she realized she was alone in this massive crowd. She tried to push back in the direction she thought she had come from, but the people were too big and too many. Every face she looked up at was unfamiliar, and no one seemed to notice the tiny girl struggling to move against the flow of bodies. The crowd continued to shift and move as the parade's start time drew near. Emma found herself being pushed further and further away from where she had last seen her mother. Tears began to stream down her cheeks as the reality of her situation sank in. She was lost, completely and utterly lost, in a sea of strangers. Meanwhile, Sarah had realized immediately that Emma was no longer beside her. Her heart pounded with terror as she began pushing through the crowd, calling her daughter's name. She tried to retrace her steps, but the constant movement of people made it impossible to know which direction Emma might have gone. "Emma! Emma!" Sarah shouted, her voice becoming hoarse with desperation. Other parents in the crowd, understanding her panic, began to help her search, but the task seemed impossible. There were simply too many people, and a small child could easily disappear among them. Back in the crowd, Emma had been carried along by the movement of people until she found herself near a different section of the parade route entirely. The area was just as packed, but the atmosphere here was somehow different. She noticed that the people around her seemed more organized, more purposeful in their positioning. As Emma wiped her tears and tried to get her bearings, she heard the distant sound of drums and brass instruments. The parade was beginning. Despite her fear and confusion, she felt a small thrill of excitement. She had never heard royal music before, and even in her distressed state, the majestic sound stirred something in her young heart. But as the music grew louder, Emma realized that her situation was becoming more desperate. Once the parade began in earnest, the crowd would become even more focused on the spectacle, making it even less likely that anyone would notice a lost little girl. She needed to find help, and she needed to find it quickly. Emma began to study the people around her more carefully. Most were ordinary citizens like her parents, but she noticed that some wore special badges or uniforms that suggested they were officials of some kind. There were police officers scattered throughout the crowd, but they were positioned far from where she stood, and she wasn't sure she could reach them through the dense pack of people. As the sound of marching feet began to echo off the buildings lining the parade route, Emma knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The royal procession was approaching, and soon everyone's attention would be completely absorbed by the magnificent display. She had to act now, but she wasn't sure what she could possibly do that would make any difference in this overwhelming situation. The thunderous sound of drums grew louder as the royal guard approached Emma's section of the parade route. She could feel the vibrations through the ground beneath her feet, and the crowd around her began to stir with anticipation. People pressed forward, straining to catch the first glimpse of the magnificent procession that was about to pass before them. Emma found herself pushed even closer to the front of the crowd by the surge of bodies behind her. For the first time since becoming separated from her mother, she had a clear view of the street. The empty roadway stretched before her like a stage waiting for the grand performance to begin. But instead of feeling excited about her improved vantage point, Emma felt even more frightened. Being at the front of the crowd meant she was more exposed, more visible, but also more alone. The people behind her were strangers who were focused entirely on the approaching parade, not on helping a lost little girl. As Emma stood there overwhelmed by her situation, she heard a different sound mixing with the drums and brass instruments. It was the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones growing steadily louder. Her heart began to race not just with fear, but with genuine excitement despite her circumstances. The first mounted guards came into view around the corner, and Emma gasped at the sight. The horses were magnificent creatures, much larger than she had imagined, with coats that gleamed like polished copper in the morning sunlight. The riders sat tall and proud in their saddles, wearing uniforms of deep red and gold that seemed to sparkle with every movement. The lead guard rode a massive black stallion that pranced and danced as it moved down the street. The horse's mane flowed like silk, and its eyes were bright and intelligent. But it was the rider who truly captured Emma's attention. He was a tall man with graying hair visible beneath his ceremonial helmet, and his bearing spoke of years of military service and discipline. This guard's uniform was slightly different from the others, with additional decorations and insignia that marked him as a person of authority. His presence commanded respect, and even from her position in the crowd, Emma could sense that this was someone important, someone who could make decisions and take action. As the procession drew closer, Emma noticed something that the excited crowd around her had missed. The lead guard was not just looking straight ahead as she had expected. Instead, his trained eyes were constantly scanning the crowd, alert for any signs of trouble or disturbance. This was clearly a man whose job was to protect and serve, someone who noticed details that others might overlook. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as the royal guard came fully into view. The sight was truly spectacular. Dozens of mounted guards in perfect formation, their horses stepping in time with the military band that followed behind them. Flags and banners fluttered in the breeze, and the sound of the music filled the air with patriotic fervor. But Emma barely heard the crowd's reaction. Her mind was racing as she watched the lead guard approach her position. She had noticed something important about him, something that gave her a glimmer of hope in her desperate situation. Unlike the other guards who kept their eyes fixed forward or on the crowd as a whole, this man was actually looking at individual faces. As he passed other sections of the crowd, Emma had seen him nod to certain people, smile at children who waved at him, and even pause his horse briefly when he spotted something that required his attention. This was not just a ceremonial figure going through the motions of a parade. This was someone who was genuinely engaged with the people around him, someone who cared about what he saw. Emma realized that this guard might be her only chance. In a few moments, he would be directly in front of her position. If she could somehow get his attention, if she could make him understand that she needed help, he might be the one person in this entire crowd who would actually notice her and take action. But how could a small 8-year-old girl possibly get the attention of a royal guard during an official parade? Emma knew that simply waving or calling out would not be enough. Hundreds of people were waving and cheering, and her small voice would never carry over the noise of the crowd and the music. She needed to do something different, something that would stand out from all the celebration around her. It had to be something that would immediately signal to the guard that she was in distress, not just an excited spectator trying to get noticed. Emma's mind raced through various possibilities. She could try to push forward into the street, but that would be dangerous and would likely just result in her being pulled back by the people around her. She could try to climb over the barriers that separated the crowd from the parade route. But she was too small and weak to manage such a feat. As the lead guard drew closer, Emma felt the precious seconds ticking away. She could see his face more clearly now, and she was struck by the kindness she saw in his eyes despite his stern military bearing. This was definitely someone who would help her if he knew she needed help. But she was running out of time to communicate her situation to him. The horse and rider were now only about 50 yards away, close enough that Emma could see the details of the guard's uniform and the gentle way he controlled his powerful mount. In just a few more seconds, he would be directly in front of her, and then he would be gone, continuing down the parade route with no idea that a lost and frightened little girl had been desperately trying to reach him. Emma knew she had to act immediately. Whatever she was going to do, it had to happen right now. In the next few seconds, or her opportunity would be lost forever. The weight of her situation pressed down on her as she prepared to make her move. As the lead guard approached within 30 yards of her position, Emma made a desperate decision. She remembered something her grandfather had taught her during his visits when he would tell her stories about his time in the military during World War II. He had explained to her about different types of signals that soldiers used to communicate with each other, especially when they needed help or were in danger. One particular signal had stuck in Emma's memory because her grandfather had made it seem so important and serious. He had shown her how soldiers would signal for help when they were wounded or trapped behind enemy lines. It was a specific gesture that any military person would immediately recognize as a distress call, completely different from the casual waves and cheers of celebration. With her heart pounding, Emma raised both of her small arms above her head and began to wave them in a very specific pattern. She crossed them back and forth in slow, deliberate movements, left over right, then right over left, repeating the motion in a steady rhythm. This was the international distress signal that her grandfather had demonstrated to her, explaining that it meant help needed immediately. Most of the adults around Emma were too caught up in the excitement of the parade to notice what the little girl was doing. They assumed she was just another child trying to get the attention of the royal guards, perhaps hoping for a wave or a smile in return. But Emma knew that what she was doing was completely different from the random waving and cheering happening all around her. The lead guard was now only 20 yards away, close enough that Emma could see the weathered lines on his face and the alert intelligence in his eyes. She continued her distress signal, putting all of her hope into those deliberate crossing movements of her arms. She kept her eyes locked on the guard's face, willing him to look in her direction and recognize what she was trying to communicate. For a moment, it seemed as though the guard would pass by without noticing her. His attention was focused on a group of rowdy teenagers who had pushed forward against the barriers, and his hand had moved to his radio as he prepared to call for additional security to handle the situation. But then, something made him turn his head in Emma's direction. Perhaps it was the contrast between her deliberate, repetitive movements and the chaotic waving of the crowd around her. Perhaps it was some instinct developed through years of military training that made him notice when something was different from the norm. When the guard's eyes met Emma's, she saw immediate recognition flash across his face. His expression changed instantly from ceremonial alertness to sharp, focused concern. He had clearly identified her arm movements as a distress signal, and his training was kicking in to assess the situation. The guard pulled back gently on his horse's reins, slowing the magnificent animal's pace as he continued to study Emma's position in the crowd. He could see that she was alone, that no adult was standing with her or watching over her. Her pale face and the desperate expression in her eyes confirmed what her arm signals had already told him. This child was in serious trouble. But the guard faced a significant dilemma. He was the lead rider in an official royal parade, with thousands of people watching and expecting the procession to continue according to schedule. Behind him rode dozens of other guards, and behind them came the royal band and various dignitaries. The entire parade was timed precisely, and any deviation from the planned route and schedule would cause major disruptions. However, his training and his conscience would not allow him to ignore a child in distress, especially one who had demonstrated enough knowledge and presence of mind to use proper military distress signals. The fact that Emma knew the correct way to signal for help suggested that her situation was genuinely serious, not just the confusion of an ordinary lost child. The guard made a quick decision. He spoke quietly into his radio, alerting his fellow guards that he was observing a potential emergency situation that required immediate assessment. He then guided his horse closer to the barriers that separated the parade route from the crowd, bringing himself within speaking distance of Emma. "Are you alone, little miss?" he called out to her, his voice carrying clearly over the noise of the crowd. His tone was gentle but urgent, conveying both authority and compassion. Emma nodded vigorously, relief flooding through her at finally having someone's attention. "I can't find my mummy," she called back, her voice breaking with emotion. "I got lost in the crowd." The guard's expression grew more serious. A lost child in a crowd of this size was indeed a serious emergency. Children could be seriously injured in the crush of people, and the longer Emma remained separated from her parents, the more dangerous her situation became. But even as he prepared to take action, the guard was acutely aware of the complications his situation presented. The parade could not simply stop for one lost child, no matter how serious her predicament. There were protocols to follow, chains of command to respect, and thousands of spectators who had come to see the royal guard perform their ceremonial duties. The guard looked back at his fellow riders, who had noticed his reduced pace and were beginning to bunch up behind him. He could see questions in their eyes, and he knew that he had only seconds to make a decision about how to handle this situation. Emma continued to maintain eye contact with the guard, sensing that this was her crucial moment. She could see the conflict playing out on his face as he weighed his duty to the parade against his duty to help a child in need. The seconds stretched out like hours as she waited to see what he would decide to do. The crowd around Emma had begun to notice that something unusual was happening. The lead guard had slowed his horse and was clearly focused on something in their section of spectators. People began to murmur and point, wondering what had captured the guard's attention during what should have been a routine parade procession. Emma felt the weight of all those eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the guard who represented her only hope of being reunited with her mother. She could see him speaking into his radio again, clearly communicating with someone about the situation he had encountered. Captain James Morrison had served in the Royal Guard for over 20 years, and in all that time he had never faced a situation quite like this. As the lead rider of the ceremonial parade, he carried the responsibility of maintaining the dignity and precision that the public expected from the Royal Guard. Yet here he was, confronted with a genuine emergency that demanded immediate action. Through his earpiece, he could hear the voice of his commanding officer, Colonel Williams, who was monitoring the parade from a command vehicle several blocks away. "Morrison, what's your status? You've slowed the procession." "Sir, I have a lost child situation," Morrison responded quietly into his radio microphone. "Young girl, approximately 8 years old, using proper military distress signals. She's alone in the crowd, separated from her parents." There was a pause before the colonel responded. Morrison knew that his superior was weighing the same difficult factors that he himself was considering. The parade was a matter of national pride and public spectacle, but the safety of a child took precedence over any ceremonial obligations. "Can local police handle it, Morrison?" came the colonel's voice. Morrison quickly scanned the area around Emma's position. He could see 2 police officers, but they were positioned at least 100 yards away and would have no way of knowing that there was an emergency situation developing. By the time they could be alerted and fight their way through the dense crowd to reach Emma, the parade would be long gone, and the child would be left in an even more vulnerable situation. "Negative, sir. Police are too far away and the crowd density is extreme. The child will be in increasing danger as the parade passes and the crowd begins to disperse." Morrison's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing the tension in its rider. Behind him, the other guards were maintaining their formation, but he could feel their confusion about the delay. The royal band was still playing, but the music had a slightly uncertain quality as the musicians tried to adjust their pace to match the unexpectedly slow procession. Emma watched this exchange with growing anxiety. She could see that the guard was talking to someone through his radio, and she could sense the seriousness of whatever conversation was taking place. But she could also see the long line of guards and musicians behind him, all waiting for the procession to continue. She began to worry that the complications of stopping a royal parade might be too great, and that she would be left alone after all. The crowd around Emma had definitely noticed that something unusual was happening. People were pointing and whispering, trying to figure out why the lead guard had slowed his horse and appeared to be focused on their section of spectators. Some were becoming impatient, wondering why the parade wasn't moving at its expected pace. "What's going on?" someone behind Emma asked loudly. "Why did they stop?" "Maybe there's a security threat," another voice suggested, causing a ripple of nervous energy to pass through the nearby crowd. Emma felt the adults around her becoming restless and concerned. She worried that if people began to panic or push forward to see what was happening, her situation would become even more dangerous. She was still trapped among all these strangers, and any sudden movement by the crowd could sweep her away from her one potential rescuer. Meanwhile, Colonel Williams was consulting with other officials who were monitoring the parade from various positions throughout the city. The decision about how to handle this situation would affect not just Emma and Captain Morrison, but the entire carefully orchestrated event that thousands of people had come to see. "Morrison, what's your assessment of the threat level to the child?" the colonel asked. Morrison looked more carefully at Emma's situation. He could see that she was indeed completely alone with no adult guardian in sight. The crowd around her was dense and occasionally pushing forward, which could easily knock down or injure a small child. Moreover, he knew that when the parade finished and people began to leave, the crowd movement would become chaotic and potentially dangerous for someone of Emma's size. "High threat level, sir," Morrison responded. "The child is at serious risk of injury from crowd dynamics, and separation from parents in a crowd of this size constitutes a genuine emergency." There was another pause as the colonel weighed all the factors. Morrison knew that his commanding officer was considering not just Emma's safety, but also the precedent that would be set by stopping a royal parade for a civilian emergency. There were protocols and procedures for almost every situation, but this particular combination of circumstances was not covered in any manual. Finally, the colonel's voice came through Morrison's earpiece with a decision that would change everything. "Morrison, you have authorization to take necessary action to secure the child's safety. Coordinate with parade security to minimize disruption, but prioritize the emergency." Morrison felt a surge of relief and determination. He had been given permission to do what his conscience and training demanded, but now he had to figure out the practical aspects of stopping a royal parade and rescuing a lost child without creating chaos or panic among the thousands of spectators. He spoke into his radio again, this time addressing the entire security team. "All units, this is Morrison. We have an authorized emergency stop for child rescue. Parade will halt temporarily at my position. Security teams, please be prepared to assist with crowd management." Morrison then turned his attention back to Emma, who had been watching his face anxiously throughout his radio conversations. He could see the hope and fear warring in her young eyes, and he felt the full weight of responsibility for her safety settling on his shoulders. "Hold on, little miss," he called out to her. "We're going to get you help right now." Emma felt tears of relief beginning to flow down her cheeks. After what felt like hours of being lost and frightened, someone was finally going to help her. But even as she felt grateful, she could see the magnitude of what was happening around her. The entire royal parade was coming to a stop because of her situation, and she could hear the murmur of confusion and concern spreading through the crowd as people realized that something significant was occurring. Captain Morrison raised his right hand high in the air, giving the formal signal for the entire parade to halt. The gesture was crisp and unmistakable, carrying with it the authority of decades of military training and command experience. Behind him, the other mounted guards immediately brought their horses to a stop, maintaining their perfect formation even in this unexpected situation. The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. The thousands of spectators who had been cheering and applauding suddenly fell into a confused silence, as they realized that the royal parade had come to a complete stop. The military band, which had been playing a stirring march, let their music trail off uncertainly as the musicians tried to understand what was happening. Emma watched in amazement as this massive, carefully orchestrated event came to a halt because of her situation. She felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was occurring, but also profoundly grateful that someone had finally recognized her distress and was taking action to help her. Morrison dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, handing the reins to another guard who rode up to assist. As his boots touched the cobblestones, he transformed from a ceremonial figure into an active rescuer. His tall frame and authoritative presence immediately commanded attention as he approached the barriers that separated the parade route from the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison called out in a clear, carrying voice that reached far beyond Emma's immediate vicinity. "We have a temporary emergency situation that requires our immediate attention. Please remain calm and assist us by staying in your current positions." The crowd around Emma began to part as Morrison approached, people instinctively making way for the uniformed official. Emma could see the concern and determination on his face as he moved toward her, and she felt a tremendous sense of relief knowing that help was finally coming. But even as Morrison approached, Emma could see the complicated situation that his decision to stop the parade had created. Behind the mounted guards, she could see a long line of vehicles carrying various dignitaries and officials, all of whom were now stopped and waiting. Police officers throughout the crowd were speaking urgently into their radios, trying to understand what had caused the halt and whether there was any security threat. Morrison reached the barrier closest to Emma's position and began to coordinate with the police officers who were moving in to assist. Emma could hear him explaining the situation in quick, professional terms, describing her as a lost child who had used proper distress signals to request help. "The little girl in the blue dress," Morrison said, pointing toward Emma. "She's been separated from her parents and is alone in the crowd. We need to get her to safety immediately and begin reunification procedures." One of the police officers, Sergeant Davies, looked skeptical about the decision to stop the entire parade for a single lost child. "Captain, couldn't this have been handled after the parade passed? We have thousands of people here, and stopping like this is causing significant confusion." Morrison's expression remained firm as he responded, "Sergeant, that child knew to use military distress signals. She's not just lost. She's in genuine danger from crowd dynamics. If we had continued the parade and left her in that crowd, she could have been seriously injured when people start to disperse." As if to prove Morrison's point, the crowd around Emma began to shift and move as people tried to get a better view of what was happening. Emma felt herself being jostled and pushed as adults around her craned their necks to see the action taking place near the barriers. She reached out instinctively, grabbing onto someone's coat to keep from being knocked down. Morrison saw Emma's precarious situation and knew that immediate action was required. "We need to get her out of there right now," he said to the police officers. "The crowd is becoming unstable." Working together, Morrison and two police officers began to carefully make their way through the crowd toward Emma's position. Morrison's uniform and commanding presence helped to clear a path, as people recognized his authority and moved aside to let him pass. As they approached, Emma felt her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and anxiety. These were the people who were going to help her, but she was still surrounded by strangers in a chaotic situation. She had been separated from her mother for what felt like hours, and she desperately wanted to be reunited with her family. "Hello there, brave girl," Morrison said gently as he reached Emma's position. He knelt down so that he was at her eye level, his voice warm and reassuring despite the urgent situation. "I'm Captain Morrison, and these officers and I are going to help you find your mummy. You did exactly the right thing by signaling for help." Emma looked up at Morrison with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I got lost when the crowd moved," she said in a small voice. "I tried to find my mummy, but there are too many people." "I know, sweetheart," Morrison replied. "But you're safe now, and we're going to get you back to your family." "Can you tell me your name?" "Emma Thompson," she answered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "My mummy's name is Sarah Thompson." Morrison nodded and immediately relayed this information to his radio team, who began broadcasting Emma's description and her mother's name throughout the security network. Meanwhile, the police officers were working to create a clear path back to the parade route, where Emma would be safe from the unpredictable movements of the crowd. As Morrison gently took Emma's hand and began to guide her toward safety, she looked back at the massive parade that had stopped because of her situation. She could see hundreds of guards, musicians, and officials all waiting because one little girl had needed help. The magnitude of what had happened began to sink in, and she felt both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. by the response to her distress. The crowd around them was buzzing with curiosity and concern as people realized that a lost child was the reason for the parade's halt. Many spectators began to look around their own sections, checking to make sure their own children were safe and accounted for. The incident had served as a powerful reminder of how quickly someone could become separated in such a large crowd. Morrison kept a protective hand on Emma's shoulder as they made their way toward the parade route, where a police vehicle was already positioned to provide a safe space for her while the search for her parents continued. But even as he focused on Emma's immediate safety, Morrison was aware that thousands of people were watching and waiting for the parade to resume. As Captain Morrison guided Emma toward the safety of the police vehicle, the security team's radio network crackled with urgent communications. Emma's description and her mother's name were being broadcast to every officer stationed along the parade route, creating an instant search network that spanned several city blocks. Within minutes of the broadcast, a response came through the radio that made Morrison smile with relief. "Unit 7 to command," came a voice filled with urgency. "We have a woman matching the description, Sarah Thompson, approximately 6 blocks back from the halt position. She's in extreme distress searching for her daughter Emma." Morrison immediately relayed this information to Emma, who was now sitting safely in the back of a police car with the door open. "Emma, we've found your mummy," he told her gently. "She's been looking for you too, and we're bringing her here right now." Emma's face lit up with joy and relief. After what had felt like an eternity of being lost and frightened, she was finally going to be reunited with her mother. But even in her happiness, she was aware of the extraordinary situation that surrounded her rescue. The entire royal parade remained at a complete standstill while her family emergency was being resolved. Meanwhile, 6 blocks away, Sarah Thompson was indeed in a state of complete panic. She had been searching frantically through the crowd for over an hour, calling Emma's name until her voice was hoarse, and pushing through the dense mass of people with growing desperation. When the police officers approached her with news that her daughter had been found, she nearly collapsed with relief. "Is she hurt? Is she safe?" Sarah asked repeatedly as the officers escorted her quickly toward a police vehicle that would transport her to Emma's location. "She's completely safe, ma'am," Officer Johnson assured her as they moved through the crowd. "Your daughter is very brave and very smart. She used proper distress signals to get help, and Captain Morrison of the Royal Guard spotted her immediately." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with her relief. Her father had indeed taught Emma about military signals during his visits, but Sarah had never imagined that such knowledge would be put to such crucial use. The thought that her 8-year-old daughter had possessed the presence of mind to use proper distress signals in such a frightening situation filled her with amazement. Back at the parade halt position, the crowd's mood had shifted from confusion to genuine concern and interest as word spread about what was happening. People began to understand that the Royal Guard had stopped their entire ceremonial parade to rescue a lost child, and many spectators were moved by the compassion and humanity displayed by the military personnel. "That captain did the right thing," Emma heard someone in the crowd say. "No parade is more important than a child's safety. Those guards are real heroes," another voice agreed. "They could have just kept going, but they stopped to help." Emma listened to these comments with growing understanding of the significance of what Captain Morrison had done for her. He had risked criticism and complications by stopping an important public event, but he had chosen to prioritize her safety over everything else. She felt incredibly grateful, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of the response to her situation. Captain Morrison remained beside the police vehicle, keeping Emma company while they waited for her mother to arrive. He could see that despite her relief at being safe, the little girl was processing the enormity of what had occurred around her. "Captain Morrison," Emma said quietly, "did I cause a lot of trouble by getting lost?" Morrison knelt down beside her again, his expression warm and reassuring. "Emma, you didn't cause any trouble at all. Getting separated in a crowd like this can happen to anyone, and you handled the situation perfectly. You knew how to ask for help in the right way, and that made all the difference." He paused and looked back at the halted parade, then returned his attention to Emma. "Besides, the most important job of any guard, whether we're in a parade or anywhere else, is to protect people who need help. Today you needed help, and we were honored to be able to provide it." Emma felt comforted by his words, but she could also see the complexity of the situation they were in. Behind Morrison, dozens of mounted guards sat perfectly still on their horses, maintaining their discipline and formation despite the unexpected halt. The royal band members stood at attention with their instruments, ready to resume playing as soon as they received the signal to continue. Throughout the crowd, thousands of spectators waited patiently, their earlier confusion having given way to understanding and even approval of the guards' actions. Many parents in the crowd were using this moment to have serious conversations with their own children about staying close and what to do if they became separated. The radio crackled again with an update. Unit 7 to command. We are 2 minutes out with the mother. ETA to reunion position is approximately 2 minutes. Morrison relayed this information to Emma, who could barely contain her excitement. She stood up in the police vehicle and looked down the parade route in the direction from which her mother would be coming. Every few seconds, she would ask Morrison if he could see the police car yet, her anticipation growing with each passing moment. The crowd around them had noticed Emma's excitement and began to share in the anticipation of the reunion. Many people were smiling and pointing toward the little girl who had captured everyone's attention, and there was a sense of collective relief that this story was about to have a happy ending. As they waited, Morrison reflected on the decision he had made to stop the parade. He knew that there would be paperwork to fill out and explanations to give to his superiors, but he felt absolutely no regret about his choice. The safety of a child took precedence over any ceremonial obligations, and he was proud of the way his entire unit had responded to the emergency. Emma's rescue had also demonstrated something important about the character of the Royal Guard. They were not just ceremonial figures, performing for public entertainment. They were genuine protectors who would take action when people needed help, regardless of the complications it might create. The police vehicle carrying Sarah Thompson came into view, moving carefully through the crowd that parted to make way for the reunion. Emma spotted it immediately and began jumping up and down with excitement, pointing and calling out to Captain Morrison that her mother was coming. As the vehicle came to a stop, Sarah practically flew out of the passenger door before it had fully opened. Her eyes immediately found Emma, and she ran toward her daughter with tears streaming down her face. Emma leaped from the police car and ran into her mother's arms, both of them sobbing with relief and joy. "Oh, Emma, my darling girl," Sarah cried, holding her daughter tight and covering her face with kisses. "I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you forever." Emma clung to her mother, feeling safe and secure for the first time since they had been separated. "Mummy, I used Grandpa's signals like he taught me, and the guard captain saw me and stopped the whole parade to help." Sarah looked up at Captain Morrison through her tears, her gratitude evident in her expression. "Captain, I don't know how to thank you. What you did, stopping the entire parade for one little girl. I can't believe the kindness and courage you've shown." Morrison smiled warmly at the reunited family. "Mrs. Thompson, your daughter is an extraordinary young lady. She kept her composure in a frightening situation and used exactly the right signals to get help. You should be very proud of her." The crowd around them had been watching the reunion with rapt attention, and when Emma and Sarah embraced, a spontaneous cheer arose from the spectators. People were applauding not just the happy ending, but also the compassion and decisiveness that Captain Morrison and the Royal Guard had demonstrated. But even as the reunion was taking place, Morrison was aware that the parade needed to resume. Thousands of people were still waiting, and there were schedules to maintain and protocols to follow. He spoke quietly into his radio, informing his commanding officer that the emergency had been successfully resolved and the family had been reunited. "Outstanding work, Morrison," came Colonel Williams's voice through the earpiece. "Take whatever time you need to ensure the family is completely secure, then we'll resume the parade." Morrison turned to Sarah and Emma, who were still holding each other tightly. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to make sure you have a safe place to watch the rest of the parade, somewhere you won't be separated again." Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Captain, what you and your guards did today, stopping everything to help a lost child, it shows what kind of people you really are. Emma and I will never forget this." One of the police officers approached with a solution to their immediate concern. "Mrs. Thompson, we've arranged for you and Emma to watch the rest of the parade from a secure viewing area with barriers and police supervision. You'll have an excellent view, and there's no possibility of becoming separated in the crowd." As arrangements were being made for Sarah and Emma's continued safety, word of what had happened was spreading throughout the entire parade route. People who had been waiting in other sections were learning about the little girl who had used military distress signals to get help, and about the Royal Guard captain who had stopped the entire procession to rescue her. The story was capturing the public imagination because it represented something profoundly meaningful about duty, compassion, and the true purpose of those who serve in uniform. Captain Morrison had demonstrated that real honor lay not in perfect adherence to ceremony, but in the willingness to act when people needed help. Emma, now secure in her mother's arms, looked back at Captain Morrison with admiration and gratitude. "Captain, will I see you again in the parade?" Morrison knelt down to Emma's level one more time. "You certainly will, Emma, and every time I ride in a parade from now on, I'll remember the brave little girl who knew exactly how to ask for help when she needed it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin bearing the insignia of the Royal Guard. "This is for you, Emma. It's to remind you that you have friends in the Royal Guard, and that you showed tremendous courage today." Emma accepted the pin with wide eyes, turning it over in her small hands and examining the detailed craftsmanship. "Thank you, Captain Morrison. I'll keep it forever." As Sarah and Emma were escorted to their secure viewing position, Captain Morrison returned to his horse and prepared to resume the parade. The crowd had watched the entire rescue and reunion with fascination, and there was a palpable sense of approval and admiration for the way the situation had been handled. Morrison remounted his horse and took his position at the head of the parade formation. He raised his hand again, this time giving the signal to resume the procession. Behind him, the other guards straightened in their saddles. The band raised their instruments, and the entire magnificent parade prepared to continue down the route. As the procession began to move again, Morrison caught sight of Emma and Sarah in their new viewing position. Emma was waving enthusiastically, still holding the Royal Guard pin he had given her, while Sarah watched with tears of gratitude still visible on her face. The crowd erupted in even louder cheers than before as the parade resumed. But now their applause carried a different quality. It was not just appreciation for the pageantry and ceremony, but genuine respect for the character and humanity that the Royal Guard had displayed. The story of Emma Thompson and Captain Morrison's decision to stop the Royal Parade would be told and retold for years to come. It became a powerful reminder that true service means being willing to act with compassion when people need help, regardless of the complications or consequences that might arise. For Emma, the experience taught her that courage and knowledge could make a difference in frightening situations, and that there were good people in the world who would help when help was needed. For Captain Morrison, it confirmed that he had chosen the right profession and that the most important moments of service often came when they were least expected. The Royal Parade continued to its conclusion, but it was forever changed by the brave little girl who had given a hidden sign to the King's Guard, and by the captain who had brought the entire procession to an abrupt stop to answer her call for help.